Yeah, I think for Casper Van Dien, this was the film that kind of gave him that big role as well, that he still recognizes Rico. He still does like little cameo bits and pieces and like comedy sketches as Rico, which I think is great. He has such a deep love for this character. And kind of what you were saying earlier about how this movie really was kind of the perfect product of its time. I don't feel like it could have been made quite the same if it was done today. I think part of the reason for that is because apparently management at Sony, which is one of the production studios, kept changing all the time. So when Paul Verhoeven and Edward Neumeier were sort of making the film, it wasn't really getting a lot of eyeballs on it until like they had basically compiled a rough cut of the movie, and then that's when the studio executives finally saw the footage. So at that point it was kind of too late for them to have any kind of interference and to do anything, to say anything, so they're able to kind of get away with a lot, I think, which works out well in favor of this movie. And I think also with the 90s, as we were kind of touching on earlier, it does have that very kind of bombastic, brash energy to it. Each act of the film, or each kind of chunk of the film, is sort of goes down this darker and darker path. It starts off very young and idealistic when they're at school. It starts off very bright. Then they kind of go to the academy and they're learning and they're training, and it's still very like, hoorah, this is exciting. We're going to have so much fun. And then, of course, there's that first battle scene on Clendathu, the invasion, where it really just kind of shit hits the fan and it goes off from there. Um, gets darker and darker and darker progressively until there's someone getting their brain sucked out by a giant bug. So really it goes on a pretty adventurous journey. But I know we were talking the first time we recorded this as well about Dizzy as the characters, just kind of jumping back
Hmm.
to the
Yeah,
each of the characters in
let's talk
this.
Dizzy, because I
Let's
know
talk Dizzy.
I know she's like, yeah,
Yeah,
go.
she's
Yeah, for
amazing.
sure.
So I loved when I was younger, they had an animated series of this show, or of this animated series of this movie, I should say, which was kind of done in that like 90s, sort of late 90s, early 2000s style of animation, computer animation. But I loved that Dizzy was such a big character in the animated series, because I think she was recognized as the fan favorite in the film, because she's so great and she's got such spunk and such energy and such charisma, and uniqueness, nerve, and attitude as well. She would be a RuPaul favorite, I think. But she's got such an energy to her that you really can't help but fall in love with her. And I think that's a great way to kind of bring her in as this side love interest, because the entire time, Rico's pining after Denise Richards' character, Carmen. Is that her name? Carmen?
Carmen, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, he's pining after Carmen. And the whole time, everyone in the audience is going like, Rico, man, she's not right for you. Dizzy's right there. You just got to go for Dizzy, man. And then so when they finally have that connection, it's just that much more impactful. And then, of course, as we mentioned before, spoilers, her death is that much more impactful as well, because I kind of feel like they did her dirty by having her go out at all, because she's such a great character, and it kind of adds into like the girl in the refrigerator trope that you see a lot in comic books as well. Um,
Hmm.
but I think that it's also kind of like it's a cool death, even though I feel like it's very brief. Like it seems like it all happens so fast, but I feel like that's also very true to how it would really unfold. Like there wouldn't be a big dramatic, I mean, there wouldn't be a big dramatic slow motion element to it, but there wouldn't be that big dramatic like, oh no, everything's happening and this is also it would be as fast as turning around and getting impaled in a couple different spots by bug chompers.
So yeah, and speaking of which, Dina Meyer was originally supposed to read for the role of Carmen.
Yeah.
And when she got the script, when she read it, she went in and said, "I really want to read for Dizzy. I thought Dizzy was more interesting, more of an interesting character as far as what she brought to the role, and she wanted to kind of dig in on that as opposed to Carmen." So they agreed. One of the reasons for that was because she tested really, really well on screen with Casper Van Dien, and
Hmm.
it was one of the reasons he got the role. He got called back, I think, 4 or 5 times before he landed the role of Rico, and a deciding factor in that was the chemistry that he had on screen with Dina Meyer. Now, I should say this too: is like when I was watching the 4K, I went back and watched some of the commentary, so I didn't watch all of it, but the commentary is very the commentary is Paul Verhoeven, Casper Van Dien, Dina Meyer, and Neil Patrick Harris. It's a very, very flirty commentary. Like I, like it's like I mean, there's a lot of beautiful people in this film, of course. That was one of the criticisms that got levied against it when it came out. But
It's Melrose Place in space.
yeah, but that was always intentional. Like that's they wanted to do it with sort of unknown actors and actresses, to give it that sense of like this sort of like youthful vigor, and they didn't want anyone too recognizable in the film. And Yeah, I mean, I think like for Dizzy, so what happened with the film was that when they tested it for test audiences, people hated Carmen. They didn't like her. She didn't test well. People thought that she was, and this is funny because, and this is something that in the commentary they kind of mention is that Verhoeven talks about how like, well, she's just enacting her own agency. Like Carmen's making her own decisions. She doesn't want to be with Rico. They put in the scene where she sends Rico the video disc saying, "Hey, we're just too far away. We can't be with one another. We got to split up." But that didn't matter. Like people were just like they hated Carmen, and Verhoeven said that some of the comments he got back on the test audience screenings were just absolutely awful. But they needed the movie to work because everyone loved Dizzy more, and they
Hmm.
thought that like Carmen was sort of like deceitful and like untrustworthy and all this stuff. Right now, I don't really think that tracks. And Verhoeven himself was like, I didn't really understand how they got that from that, but it was just what the test audiences went through. Just for the record, I'd love to be in a test audience because I think I give really good feedback. But anyway, it's interesting too because her role is really cut down. Like so, Denise Richards' role was cut down. She didn't really complain too much because it was her first major big blockbuster. I think it was her first major film before she went on to do other stuff like Valentine and Wild Things, of course. But so she just kind of said, well, whatever. But there are some scenes that are cut down, and in the end, there's a scene at the very end of the movie where there's a cut scene where Casper Van Dien and Denise Richards where they kiss at the end because they're back together. And so this girl that he's been chasing since the start of the movie, they actually end up together. But she tested so horribly, like or I shouldn't say Denise Richards tested horribly. The character tested horribly. The plot tested horribly. It just wasn't what the audience wanted. They wanted something different, so they just remained kind of friends at the end, and not romantically involved. So interesting that they went that way, but there is some funny scenes. Essentially, the plot is based on the fact that like Carmen's family is are citizens. They've served, and Rico's family are obviously civilians, and so it's sort of like that class struggle between the two families, which is why she doesn't want to link up with him because like her father doesn't approve and all this stuff. So all that stuff's cut from the film. You never really get a sense of that.
Hmm.
But it is interesting how that's sort of translated because and Verhoeven actually does mention this looking back. Obviously, the commentary was made obviously after the movie was released, but and he says like if it was a man, it wouldn't have been a big deal, but for
Yeah.
some reason because it was a woman, it like he was fairly offended by it because he said it shouldn't have mattered, but that's they had to get the script or they had to get the movie and the cut down to something that they could market,
Yeah.
and of course you use your test audiences to do that. So yeah, very interesting development.
Yeah, I feel like I
Yeah.
feel like it was if test audiences today like wouldn't have that same reaction. I don't know if that was a very 90s way to approach relationships in movies, but like again, Carmen having her own agency and making that decision to sort of say like, "Hey, you know what? I have these ambitions and goals and I really want to move ahead with what I'm doing and I know you're really enjoying what you're doing and I think it's just best if we see other spaceships essentially." I think that that would I feel like that would sort of go over so much better with
Someone
audiences
please use that in
today.
the future. I think we need to see other spaceships.
We do see other spaceships. So I feel like that would go over much better with audiences today because I feel like audiences are a lot more appreciative or like that we look for that sort of thing more like we want the female characters to have that agency and to like put herself first and not just be like arm candy that like, oh, he joined the army because of you and so you should just be with him because he wants you to be with him. Like that's not a good enough reason for you to stay in a relationship because somebody wants to be with you if you don't want to be with them anymore. So I don't know, I feel like that seems like a very 90s thing, a very 90s way to approach those sort of love stories. I'd be really curious if this movie had not already existed, how it would have tested today.